What is the forgotten adoption option? Many are aware of infant international adoption, where you hire an agency, often wait a long time, and spend tens of thousands of dollars. And then there's becoming a foster parent, where you may or may not adopt the children. But there is a third option, where you adopt children directly from the foster care system. I call this the forgotten adoption option. In fact, 30% of children currently in foster care are adoptable, and you don't need to be a traditional foster parent to adopt them. Hi there, I am Marcy Bursack. After blogging my experience adopting a pair of biological siblings through the foster care system, people started asking me to explain the process to them. And it's difficult to navigate, but the families I mentor feel that knowing the barriers, the challenges, and what to expect has actually helped them persevere and pursue their dream of adopting. And while I would love to have a really big family, adopting thousands of children isn't exactly realistic, but I can teach others how. Whether you're trying to figure out how to get started, you're battling some doubts and fears, or maybe you know someone who wants to adopt, I'm here with resources to help others discern if foster care adoption is the path for them. And if it is, I have practical tips and resources for them as well. You can find all of these resources, which include my blog, 3 books, an app, and a classroom lesson at forgottenadoptionoption.com. However you found this podcast, I am so glad that you did. I want to extend an invitation to you to reach out to me to ask anything on your heart. My goal is to help every waiting child be in their forever family. And that's why I host this podcast. Welcome to the Forgotten Adoption Option podcast. In this episode, you'll hear the realities that Michael faced as he aged out of the foster care system. Michael and I connected through Facebook, and when he shared with me some of the twists and turns he faced growing up and then growing out of the foster care system, I really thought, man, my listeners could really benefit from hearing about your experiences. And so I invited Michael to this interview. So, hey, Michael.
Hey, nice to meet you.
This is so much fun. So Michael's got like some cool sleeve tattoos and really fun blonde hair. So you'll see him in in the thumbnail. Yeah. They don't get to see this part. We get to see each other in video because it makes it easier to interact. But he lives in California and has a career as a technology manager within the banking industry. So what's so cool to me is if you were a coworker of Michael's, you might not know his backstory and just how incredible of a persevering person he is. So we're going to share that with you. So Michael, why don't we start off with, people might go search for you and see that your LinkedIn profile looks very professional, which it does, and have no single idea about the fact that you were in foster care at what point. So I'm wondering, can you share with us how old you were when you went into state care and what that experience was like?
Well, I lost my family on the 4th of July in 1970, and went to stay with an uncle. And my uncle was not a nice person, so I went into the system. I was taken off at him. I met my first caseworker when I was 6 years old. Her name was Mrs. Goodwin, and she had a little station wagon. I'm sure some of the other people who listen to this podcast can relate to meeting their first caseworker. And she pulled up in a little silver station wagon. That's pretty much all I remember is the car. And I remembered I had one little suitcase in the back of it, and my whole world changed at that point. And I went into the system. I went to I believe at that time, a receiving home, and then several foster homes after that.
I think modern day we would call a receiving home or an emergency placement. Maybe they changed the language on that.
Well, I think a receiving home basically is when you're between either foster families or between placement. It's kind of a temporary. Receiving home is not a permanent place. So I grew up on the East Coast, so back then and on that coastline they called it a receiving home. So basically it's kind of a way station until they can find permanent placement for you, whether it's with a foster family or whether it's in a group home or an orphanage, which they actually call them group homes, at least when I grew up. So.
Okay, so I think about the 4th of July, and I don't know what everyone's traditions are, but I'm thinking for me, there's this evening and there's fireworks. And so are you able to even participate in that? Was it earlier in the day? Because it sounds like that day was very memorable to you.
I wasn't able to for quite a few years, because that day carried a very heavy payload with it, and I didn't actually see my first fireworks till I was in my 40s. It was a day for me to I want to say quietly reflect, but it was a day to isolate and just be caught up in that day, in 1970 when it all went down. That's I carried with myself throughout a lot of myself the victimization that came with that, and you know, when you're a victim as a child, um, it's okay. But when you carry that victimization into your adulthood, it tends to cause you a lot of problems. You know, because I believed because of what happened, I believed the world owed me, you know, and I acted on it, you know, and caused myself a lot of problems and a lot of other people problems. People that tried to get in my life, you know, I would shut them out of my life, you know, in one way or another. So, you know, I think being a victim was what I carried with me on the Fourth of July for a lot of years. You know what I mean? And I realized later on that is not what my mom would have wanted. You know, she would want me to go out, and somebody actually told me that. A very spiritual person that I met told me that because it had never occurred to me what my mom wanted. You know, all I knew is that she had left it. You know, in a very tragic way. So, you know, I've had a lot of people along in my life who, in retrospect, who have coached me along and lifted me up when I need to be lifted up.
And so it sounds like, though, this simple sentence, powerful sentence, this isn't what your mom would want. Did you hear it the first time someone said it to you, or like was it later reflecting that it really sunk in?
No, I didn't really hear it the first time because I wasn't really open to it. Um, you know, I think it was actually a person I'd been dating, and she was frustrated when, you know, when Mother's Day would come around and she would want to participate and do things with her mom, you know, and I wouldn't want to participate. Fourth of July, we would get invited to barbecues and things like that, and I would not participate. And I think, you know, it kind of became a source of contention between us. And you know, and so I think it was brought to my attention kind of as a, well, you just snap out of it, you know, this isn't what your mom would want, blah, 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 blah. But it wasn't like a moment where we just sat down and talked about it. So of course I reacted in the way I reacted, but you know, again, it sat in the back of my brain for a long time. And, you know, she was long gone by the time I celebrated my first 4th of July.
Wow. And I know before you and I hit the record button, we were talking a bit about how I'm aware that there are people with a very similar, there are other people that listen to this podcast that have aged out of the system. And so I really love the freedom that you're giving people to help talk about victim mentality and how to overcome that and how you really had to work through that. I think that gives me, people like me, empathy to say, oh, wow, like, okay, that's helpful to pay attention to people that are in our lives. But I think for other people who that's a first person experience, I think you're giving a lot of food for thought, which is really beautiful. And so at one point, you're adopted by someone you knew, but then you were later taken back into care. Can you explain that?
When I was 9 years old. Okay, so my uncle, and I was taken off of my uncle, and I first went in the system. Between the age of 6 and 9, I went through, I believe, 2 or 3 group home, receiving home situations, and 8 foster families, and that's within 3 year of a 3 year period. So when I was 9 years old, I was in middle school, 5th grade, and I met one of my 5th grade school teachers. She was, I guess, kind of taken aback with my behavior because after being bounced around so much, I was a very destructive child. I was a violent child. I was an angry child, and so I believe that she had approached people and said, "What is wrong with this kid?" You know, and at that time, they were not, or they had, I guess, been trying to conceive and had not had any children. So they were actually looking at adoption. Her and her husband, my 5th grade teacher, and so they approached, you know, I guess my caseworker and said, you know, we want to take this child in, and I don't think that they had the kind of education that you're trying to offer with your podcast and things like that back then, to really know what they were getting into with a child who had been through so much trauma, you know, the first 8 years of his life, passed around basically like an old suitcase, you know, and you know, and I'm, you know, it's like you could have the nicest dog in the world, but you kick him enough times, he's gonna turn around and bite you, period, you know, and that was my story. So yeah, so when they got me at 9 years old, they weren't quite prepared. So there were several. Went through 2 or 3 different schools at that time, expelled. they had got me a job on the farm, and I assaulted another kid on the farm. I had assaulted another kid in the park. I wouldn't just go out and attack people, but I was also, because of abuse and things that I had suffered, I was also very quick to bring violence, a different level of violence to a situation, than people were ready for. And so that's kind of what happened with the beavers, and it ended in a very violent way.
Because your reaction was violence, like that's how you knew to cope.
That's how I knew. Well, that's the only thing I had, that's the
Yeah.
thing, because I was acting out of fear, my whole life I was afraid. I didn't I was afraid and I was confused. And so, and I had never been taught any coping skills at all, through any of it, really. Much later on in life as an adult that I learned how to cope with anything.
Which is so just startling, sad, but great that you did get to go through that. We've had some other podcast guests that one in particular talks about how he grew up in the system. And I think some of us, as we scroll through social media, we see kids with signs about, and my kids had them when we had their adoption day, I've been in care for this many days. And I've really been thinking about that a lot, going, I don't know, like, is that a number I really want people to be aware of? Like, is that really kind of the medallion to wear, to say I was stuck in the system for this long? And because some have been very, like you were in this system and ended up aging out of it. So I'm wondering, Michael, so you kind of gave us a little bit about some of the challenges that you were facing in your behaviors and the difficulties. Let's flash forward to your teenage years. So having gone through what you went through, how would you describe your teenage self?
Teenage self, when I got to my forever group home, I guess you would call it, when I was 13 years old, after the beavers had given me back at 11, I went through, there was actually a suicide attempt at the age when the beavers gave me back. See, that's the one thing with adoption, is that I think when you really take that step to adopt a child, because especially a child of my age at 9 years old, that's not an older child per se, not a teenager, but it's a child that's, typically when they're in the system at 9 years old, they've been through a lot of stuff, more than a young mind is capable of handling. And so when they gave me back, I just wanted out of the world. So I cut my wrists. The very first receiving home I was put in, after being taken off of the beavers, that night, the very same night I got to the receiving home, I cut my wrists.
Because you're feeling this like deep rejection, right? Like you had people commit to you.
Yeah. And
it wasn't what happened. That to me feels so heavy. And you were how old at that point?
I was 11. And they, as a child growing up, being bounced around in foster families, see, there were a lot of other foster kids in some of the families I was in. And some of the foster families I was in weren't really good places back then. But I remember talking to other kids, and they would talk about adoption and things like that. I learned about adoption and the possibility of adoption through other foster kids, right? Because that was kind of like, some kids grow up dreaming, about being a fireman. Some kids grow up about being a policeman or whatever your dream is. When you're a child in the system at a very young age, your dream is to have a forever family. To you, that's all that matters. You don't see anything past that. So when that happened for me, even though I did not know how to behave or anything like that, because I was a wild animal, it wasn't that I didn't want that forever family. I did. And so when that imploded, the only way out I saw was not to be in this world. And I spent a lot of my life not wanting to be in the world, just because of being passed around like that, and being given up, after being adopted.
That's so heavy, Michael. And even as an adult, for you to talk about it, I think that for me, a huge takeaway is that those decisions that we make, right, as adults for children are very impressionable, right? And they stick with you, and there's so much there, right? Because there's like, well, they were trying, they tried to go through the training. They cared. Teachers are helpers. They're kind of one of the most common people to get involved in this space. I'm married to one of them. Like, it's like this prevalent thing, which is wonderfully great that we have people in this world that are compassionate, but sometimes the behaviors can become a barrier, right? And in your situation, it sounded like you didn't really have anyone to lean on at that point, because who you thought you could disappeared. And so you had a lot of change and a lot of, like you mentioned, some places that were maybe better for you than others. And I've never heard the term forever group home before.
Yeah.
Did you move into that place thinking this is the last one I'm going to, or how would you characterize what makes up a forever group home?
Because I moved around so much, I didn't know what was happening. You know what I mean? I would get to families and I'd be there for a week and then I'd be gone, and I wouldn't know what happened. I didn't know if it was the money. It wasn't, I mean, I wasn't always, in every situation, I wasn't this horrible child. Just, I would just be passed on. And so when I got to Midlothian Boys Group Home in Youngstown, Ohio, which actually has since burned down. But when I got to that home, when I was 12 years old, I didn't know what was happening next. It was just another place at that moment. But I got to that home and there were 18 beds. I was one of 18 boys. I was also ethnically, racially, I was a minority. So I was picked on a lot by the other boys, until I could stand up on my own, until I got bigger and until they accepted me. But what happened with me in my teenage years is the other guys I was in that home with, the other 17 of them, they were, I'll be honest, they were all criminals. We were all criminals. I became a criminal, we were robbing houses, we were robbing people, we were doing drugs. I got into drugs at that point, marijuana and alcohol and cocaine and other things. And that was my whole teenage years, was being, again, bounced. I wasn't bounced from home to home to home anymore because I didn't have anywhere else to send
But you
me.
still brought all of that trauma with you, right?
Yeah.
And you still brought all of
Yeah.
what it felt like with you.
And so were all my roommates, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I remember I had a roommate, John, and his mother, was addicted to drugs, really badly addicted to drugs, had no rights to see John. And she would come really wasted onto the front porch, and she wasn't allowed on the property, and prostitute, and just really a bad scene. And she would just be banging on the door for John and screaming, "I want to see my son." And the house parents would threaten to call the police on him, and sometimes have the police removed. And John would just cry. Here's a 16, 17-year-old kid just sobbing. And I think about, all of us were in kind of similar situations. We all came from, different backgrounds and things like that, but we were all kind of in the same boat, in that we had lost everything that we thought we'd ever cared about. We felt that the world didn't care about us, so we didn't care about the world, and that's a tough place to be as a child, but that's a lot of older children in the system feel that way. They may not know it. I didn't know it at that point. I thought I was just surviving, but I went from being a victim to a victimizer.
Wow. And somehow, I don't know, some of us adults at that age with you might be like, why are you behaving this way? Like, come on, but there's so much to what you just shared that you went through. And then to be in this home, which it's great that there's house parents, right? But it's you're fitting into the social norm. I worked in a homeless shelter for a while, so like the social norm of the group dynamics there are very challenging. I could only imagine what that was like for you. Already feeling all of the things you went through, and then to try to be accepted and part of the group, and they kind of, I guess I'd say, like self-medicate, right?
I was gonna say, God bless the house parents. At the
Yeah.
time, I hated them, but when I look back on anybody who'd been in my life, I mean, literally my entire childhood, I have very, very fond memories of my house parents, because they don't make any kind of money at all, which I didn't know at the time. I didn't know what people made, financially. I had no idea. but they didn't make any kind of money. They just did it because they love children, and they wanted to help us, you know what I mean? And they would often, they had their own quarters in the orphanage, and they would oftentimes, their wife would come and stay with them, and their wives would tolerate us, and their wives would try to talk to us and be nice to us, try to be a mother figure, even though none of us had mothers, you know what I mean? That's a tough thing when you got a bunch of boys who don't have a mother, and you come in on the weekends and try to be a mother to them. But now in retrospect, I have nothing but the hugest admiration for everything that they tried to do for me.
I hope there's a house parent that listens to this, because it's like, at the time I was a knucklehead, but I actually am so grateful. So that's fun, right? As an adult to have that reflection. So Michael, today you're employed in a leadership position, which, I mean, there's all these things about like, here's the fate of kids that age out of foster care. And you broke through all of that, which that's, to me, like just the story and the influence you have in that. I'm curious, what was your turning point, or what drove you to focus on goals and actually developing yourself, like kind of getting out of that victim mentality?
Well, I to be honest with you, I got tired of going to jail, because the things that I did as a teenager, I was incarcerated as a teenager several times, but when you become an adult or getting close to becoming an adult, the law, they've had enough, right? So they do, the only thing that they can do with you is, there's your past counseling and all this other stuff, is they just start locking you up. And I was in and out of jails for many, many years, and there was just always something in my life that I wanted something more, and I didn't know how to get there. And the thing that was blocking me was my own victimization, my own thinking that, God, the world owes me, and why did this have to happen to me? And where's my family, and where's my presents on Christmas, and all these things, and I would just spiral into those thoughts. And as I got older, and I got tired of being in the penal system and mental institutions, I've been in a few of those, and and just rehabs, dealing with drug addiction and things like that. I mean, I've been through a lot of those things as an adult. I just, as they say in recovery, they say I got sick and tired of being sick and tired. And so what changed for me is, and what I would love to tell people, that young people that are in the system or aging out of the system now, is you have, and I had opportunities that other kids didn't have, like normal kids didn't have, but I didn't pick those. I didn't use those opportunities. Like, when I went to college finally when I was 38 years old. And and I went to ITT Technical Institute, and I learned computer engineering. And the only reason I did that is because I had this crappy job doing data entry, and I saw a guy come in and fix the computer, and I'd never seen anybody do that. And I thought that was the smartest guy in the world, and I wanted to know how he did it. And he
It's like a wizard.
Yeah, I was blown away, and I'd never seen anybody do anything like that, and so it took me a few years, but I got sober, and then I finally got enrolled in college. And then they were asking about there was something on the questionnaire. And then I could have gotten, if I would have gone to school when I was younger, I would have had it paid for, just because I was a ward of the state. You know what I mean? So
but there's so much there, Michael, like the support system and all the pieces that get you there, right? So it's a great benefit.
Yeah, and then
your head's in the game. Yeah.
Other benefits, at the time I didn't realize that the world cared, but the state does care about us. You know what I mean? We have a very narrow. I had a very narrow view of the world, of what was around me. But there are state programs and things like that it says it right in the Bible. The orphans are the most important in the world. They're the most important to our God. And the widows and the orphans. And so we're the most important to God. Why wouldn't we be the most important thing to anyone? You know what I mean? And once I realized that, and of course I tried to play that card when I was 38 years old. I grew up, but I guess there's a time limit on when you can get the so anyway, I ended up taking out student loans, and I had because my credit was so bad at the time, because I ruined my life. I had somebody co-sign, for me to go to school and that type of thing. That's kind of what started my career. Started my career in technology. and not to brag, but I'm actually an associate vice president of the bank.
You should totally tout that. I think that's wonderful. That's why I'm like, please, people understand, like, these could be your coworkers. And for kids that are aging out, like, you can become anything.
I went from robbing banks to being an associate vice president of a bank. How does that happen? How that happens is that there was something deep inside of me, which I feel is God, that always had a bigger plan for me. And once I got out of that victim mentality and realized that, you know what, I can't change the past. I can't continue to hate the people that hurt me, because they don't know. Number one, they don't know I'm hating them. Number two, they're probably not around anymore. Number three, they might have not even have known at that time they were hurting me. And number four, they were probably sick people. So, but if I realize that, then it allows me to move on and say, you know what, I don't have to love them, but I can move on from what was done to me. You know what I mean? By this world, and I can make a better life for myself. You know what I mean? But it took me a long time to realize that.
That sounds like someone that's unpacked a lot and gone through some great counseling. And it sounds like you've gone through a lot of that healing journey, which I really encourage our listeners, even those that might be thinking about going this path of adoption. Like I myself went through therapy, because you've got this baggage, this stuff from your childhood that can influence how you behave and what you're comfortable with. So I love, Michael, that you're sharing the other side of the story of how you've worked through your own things and been able to kind of let that go but own it, and at the same time go and pursue dreams. So I'm curious, Michael, we kind of jumped like teenage Michael to like late 30s Michael. What were you doing in between?
Yeah, going in and out of jail. I was, throughout my 20s, what happened for me, how I aged out of the system. Back in the 70s and 80s, which I graduated high school in 1983, they had a program, and they don't do it anymore, but as long as you didn't have any felony convictions as a teenager, I was actually convicted of an armed robbery when I was 17. And the judge, and this is the program, he said, you can either do 2 years in a state prison as an adult, right? And at 17, I was terrified to go to state prison, even though I eventually went there anyway. But at 17, or you can go 6 years in the Marine Corps. And so I, of course I took the Marine Corps. I'm like, hell yeah, I'll go to the Marine Corps. And, but with the Marine Corps, what happened for me with the Marine Corps was that by that time I'd been, introduced to drugs and alcohol, and those things kind of took over. And I lost my career in the Marine Corps after 2 years, and ended up back in Ohio, the same place I had escaped from, and just, running with the bad crowd, playing that victim mentality. I was dealing drugs, I was committing, crimes and things like that, and just in and out of the system, and I came to California about almost 30 years ago as a result of a crime I committed, and I was basically escaping and came to California, and that's all been resolved. So, I don't have any warrants or anything like that anymore. Through my whole 20s they were a mess. I got married and I had a child, and I wasn't in her life at all. I'm actually in her life now. We got off the phone earlier this afternoon, and she tells me I love you, Daddy. She's 31 years old, and she's been through a lot. Even though I didn't raise her, she's Daddy's girl. She's went down the criminal trail too, and the drug trail, and she lost her mom when she was 17. That's why she died of leukemia. That's how my daughter ended up back in my life. At 17, she lost her mom, and I got a letter in the mail. Your daughter would like contact with you. And so she came into my life, and she's been in there ever since. Through the good, the bad, and the ugly.
But you're doing it. You're where you are now, and you've got this healthy relationship. I mean, I think that's huge, and I think that's such hope for maybe some of us that have kids that are a little rough around the edges, and we're thinking, oh no, what's going to happen, or this is so hard, or man, we're very aware that there's a giant need for kids that are teenagers to be adopted. I don't know. And so I just want to thank you, Michael, for sharing such candor in your own journey. I know we have families listening that are adopting teenagers that they themselves might feel a little like, I kind of wanted to do this, but I'm aware of where this is going, and I'm not sure. And I think you've given us just kind of the long-term vision, right? That it's like, it's not about the right now. Like we're all kind of growing and healing in that piece of it. So Michael, I have never asked anyone this question, and I am so delighted to ask you this question.
Yeah.
For the listeners who are youth, who are about to, or who have aged out of the foster care system, what advice do you have for them as they try to figure out how to have a stable and successful adult life?
The most important thing that I can tell anyone who's aging out of the system or is recently aged out of the system, or anyone who's been aged out of the system for many years and is still feeling those things, your circumstances do not define you unless you allow them to. You know, you you have a better life. You can have a much better life once you realize that the past can't be undone, no matter how horrific it was and how terrible it was and how unfair it was. Um, if you allow that to affect the rest of your life, it will. But if you don't, it won't. And you grow from that once you put that past behind you. And my past is always in the background, it still affects the way I respond to things and the way I react to things, but it doesn't define me anymore. It doesn't control me anymore. I don't act on those impulses and those reactions from my childhood. I'm not that 5-year-old boy who lost a family anymore. And I'm a vice president of a bank. That's my identity today. Embrace the identity of who you are today, not of where you came from, because that's gone. You can't do anything about it.
That's so good. So Michael, I wonder if you'd share, because some people might be thinking, whether you just talked to the group that's either aging out or about to, or they're adults going, Michael, I'm very curious with your history. How did you get a job? Was it hard? Can you tell us that piece of your story?
It was very hard. For years, I worked in a car wash. The last time I got out of prison, I worked at a car wash for many years. Probably about 8 years I worked at a car wash. I also volunteered and got paid well, I wouldn't even say volunteered. I did work part-time at a community college. And there are programs, if you do get yourself in trouble, there are people out there who want to see you do better and who will give you opportunities to do better. But there's a flip side of that coin. You have to be trying to do better. And eventually I got, my criminal record was expunged. That's how I work for a bank now, and I have robbery convictions. How does that happen? Well, how it happens is just like I don't allow my past to define me. The world doesn't allow. I don't allow the world to define me either by my past. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
I'm
I love that.
person, and they see that in me.
I love that. Thank you for sharing that. I used to work with the reentry population, and I got to learn some of the paths, the different agencies that would, they had opportunity that kind of was like this unknown path. And I just think it's encouraging, Michael, to know that, yeah, I made some mistakes, but it wasn't over. And there was lots of opportunity still to have at it as long as I was willing to work for it. So Michael, as we close, is there anything that you want to say to our listeners who might be the parent that's thinking about the 8-year-old, the 11-year-old, the 17-year-old to adopt them? Or can you give any advice for people that are considering adopting older children out of the foster care system?
Well, the best advice I can give is just understand, know everything you can about that child's history. Sit down, and talk to the child and understand the child. I don't think, the family that adopted me ever really, they kind of got my background story and things like that, but I don't ever remember them trying to connect with me and to bond with me about where I truly came from. They just went by what they were told. And I don't ever remember moments of them sitting down and saying, we want to completely understand you. And the only way that we can do that is by you telling us whatever you feel comfortable telling us, but tell us about your past and how you feel about your past, and be sincere and also know that the most important thing you can do, thank God, I didn't die after that suicide attempt, that there was a distinct possibility, because the Beavers gave me back, they gave me back to the system. And so when you do take that step, make sure you completely understand that child, really, really make a concerted effort. And, because children who have been bounced around need more care and more understanding. And this sounds crazy, but then a newborn infant, right? They're not a clean slate. You know, you're not dealing with a clean slate. You're dealing with a slate that's cloudy and smudged and streaked in places. And you have to understand those clouds and those streaks and those smudges before you take that step. And no matter what, you know, you've taken that on. You wouldn't give up your own child. And when you accept a child as an adopted child, they are your own child, and that child has to always feel that way, no matter what.
So good. And I love that it's coming from you, Michael, because it's one thing to like read a really wonderful story and it sounds nice, but you've lived this and you can speak from experience. And so I think all of us listening have benefited so much, Michael, from the pieces that you've shared. And I'm so grateful of your openness to talk about what you've been through and to give us the reality of today and how you're still who you are who you are, right? But you're really living out and growing in ways that you're really proud of. And I think we're all really proud of you too, Michael. So thank you so much for letting us hear your story.
Thank you, Marcy. It's been a pleasure. I appreciate everything you're doing.
Listeners, did you know that you've helped the Forgotten Adoption Option podcast rank in the top 30% most followed podcasts on Spotify? You are helping waiting children be seen, and you're teaching our nation how to adopt these children. You can help this podcast reach more future adoptive parents by leaving a review and continuing to share this podcast with others. You can even help others know that instead of Googling to try to figure out how to adopt, they should go to ForgottenAdoptionOption.com, where they can learn the step-by-step process, tips for enduring the journey, and I even have a children's book to celebrate the forever families all around us. It means so much that you took the time to listen to this episode. And on behalf of the 113,000 children who each has a name, a story, and dreams, and deserves to grow up experiencing the love and support that is found in a forever family, I thank you so much for caring.